Hi everyone, hope you are all doing well and welcome to my review video on New World. I've ended up racking up hundreds of hours in this damn game now between the various alpha stages and the much more recent beta test, and for some reason it just keeps drawing me back in despite the game having some pretty obvious problems. So I wanted to take the time to kind of summarise my thoughts about the different positive and negative aspects of the game, what I'm looking forward to release and what I'm hoping gets fixed. So this can hopefully help you decide if this is going to be a game that you want to get stuck into or one for you to avoid. If you're watching this video sort of as it goes live, then you'll obviously heard about the delay pushing the game's release back to the 28th of September. I think ultimately this was the right decision. The beta did have a lot of positive aspects, but it did still have a number of bugs and issues during the beta, and a month simply wouldn't have been enough time for them in my opinion to sort of get this all sorted. Hell, I'm not even sure 2 months is really enough time, but at least they now have a fighting chance, particularly where some of the sort of server stability stuff in the wars was concerned. So I want to break this video down into a few parts and cover different aspects of the game, and initially I want to cover the PvE side of things. From questing to the expeditions, I think this is probably a weaker part of the game. The core mechanic base upon which this is all built actually seems pretty solid, but the quests themselves often feel pretty repetitive. Run here, kill X, gather X, it's the same sort of stuff over and over again. The main story quest itself is broken up so regularly by level caps, and so I feel like you really never managed to get into any of the lore or more immersive parts of the questing system because it's just so regularly broken up by these caps. I'd also say the same is true to some extent of the expeditions. Most of them aren't exactly overly complicated or challenging, and whilst some, such as the depths, can be pretty fun the first time around, working out your routes around these lasers, through some of the puzzles and monsters in these dungeons, it's often the same monsters that you're finding in the dungeons are the ones you see in the open world, or at least they're just reskinned versions of them that also make use of the same animations, and let's face it, they don't exactly present a massive threat, they're just a grind that you've got to get through. All of this then combined with the town project still being a dominant leveling method kind of makes for a slightly flawed PvE experience. I suppose, to some extent, this kind of makes sense when you consider that only a couple of years ago, the game was supposed to be this sort of open world survival MMO. They've had to produce a lot of PvE content in a very short space of time. And actually, when you consider the state of the game just 1 year ago, in the preview event, the improvement is huge. It's just that it still has a long way to go and improve yet. I think in the months and years post-release, it's going to get a lot better, because as I say, I think it's a really good base. But if you're a hardcore PvE player, this is worth bearing in mind if you're planning to play on day one, that it certainly has its flaws. One area, however, where I think they've done really well is the crafting system. I just absolutely love it. It just combines a very user-friendly UI interface and simple to learn system with lots of more in-depth features, making use of gear score, really good amount of material variety, you can use food too to boost your crafting level, and your crafting level improves your gear score. When you get to some of the more max level stuff, you'll be pulling legendary crafting resources from different professions but also from the open world, and it produces this system that is really easy to sort of pick up and learn, but also feels like it has a lot of depth to it in not only the crafting but also the resource gathering side of things as well. And if nothing else, the resource gathering sounds are some of the best I've ever heard in a game. I could happily listen to mining iron ore nodes all day. This then leads us onto the PvP side of things. Obviously, as mentioned earlier in the video, the game used to be this sort of hardcore PvP survival MMO, so inevitably some people are going to be upset that PvP is different to what it used to be. But I want to make my judgment on the current system, not on what it could have been or what I'm upset about previously, on the current system. And as someone who has spent the last few years playing a game almost entirely focused around PvP, I've honestly been really enjoying the New World PvP system. Yeah, I can't go and gank a solo miner anymore who has no interest in PvP, but honestly, it would have been a really crap fight anyway, so I much prefer the flagging system. And through beta at least, I saw quite a few flagged players and had some really awesome fights. Sometimes they were just solo, sometimes as a group, and other times where these almost like full faction skirmishes broke out around the edges of towns. I also really like the PvP scaling system. If you're not aware what this is, basically it applies a level difference handicap. So for example, if a level 30 player gets into a PvP fight with a level 45, then the damage is scaled accordingly. Now of course, the level 45 player still has the distinct advantage, but at least the lower level now has kind of a fighting chance, and it goes some way to stopping higher level players just sort of camping outside lower level zones, trying to hunt new players unwise enough to flag. I kind of do wish, however, that PvP rewards were slightly higher, as currently it's not really a viable way to level, and it's more just an element of side fun. If rewards for kills and maybe a higher percentage reward for being flagged were viable, then I think it would be a better way. Of course, while we are covering PvP, it would be remiss of me to not talk about the 50v50 faction wars and a little bit about faction balance as well. So these 50v50 siege battles between the different factions are sort of for control of territory in New World, and honestly it's a really cool idea. Basically, the attackers have to clear and capture a series of points outside the fort before they then need to kind of break through the main gates and siege the final flag inside the fort. It certainly makes for some pretty epic battles, and honestly it's a lot of fun. It did however have a few connectivity issues during the beta, and it kind of made it a little bit laggy at certain points. I'm kind of hoping this is one of the areas that's really going to benefit from the delay to the game, and hopefully it's going to be something that they actually can get sort of sorted before the release. I've also heard some comments that sort of say this is a very company focused game mode, not very solo player friendly, and I can kind of understand that, but I think realistically having some high sort of tier endgame guild focused content is really a good thing in a game like this. Really gives it an element of replayability for a lot of players, particularly obviously the ones in the guilds. I've also heard problems about faction balance, but I think faction balance is always in a problem in MMOs like this. I guess probably the most famous example is World of Warcraft, where whole servers have basically sort of horde only or alliance only, as it has a sort of steamroller effect. Let's face it, if a new player joins a server, opens his map to find every city is basically owned by the marauders, then most players are going to end up picking marauders. They're not going to choose to get stomped on. I don't have a great solution for this. I've heard quite a few people suggesting server faction caps, but when many players are going to be joining a server to play with friends, and factions have a 120-day cooldown before you're allowed to swap, this could really easily backfire in my opinion and really limit the ability of players to play with their friends. I think maybe some buffs or debuffs to certain factions based on player population could be a better way of doing it, to try and encourage people who aren't affiliated with a certain faction to pick a certain one to try and balance it out, but I certainly can't see that putting hard caps would be a very viable way of doing it. So it's obvious that New World certainly has some issues, some of which I'm hoping are going to be sorted either before or at least not long after release. But despite these issues, why do I find New World so addictive? For example, I know the beta was only going to run for 2 weeks, and it's going to get wiped at the end, yet I still couldn't help but jump in feet first, start levelling up and exploring Eternum, and now the beta has ended, I find myself still having New World cravings, a huge desire to see launch just so I can get back into game. I'm not really sure I can even pin down exactly what it is that causes me to be so addicted to New World. But I'm certainly not the only one to say it. Maybe it's just blind desire to have a new MMO, but I'd like to think it's kind of how the game works together as a whole. Walking out of town into the beautifully immersive scenery and world, running your quests with your guildmates before getting into a small PvP skirmish on the way back, gathering enough resources to level your crafting or craft that item you've been wanting to get, gives the game a very distinct feeling of progression. And despite the issues, I'm still super excited to play. So I guess this leads us to the question right back at the start of the video. Should you play this game? And I guess it depends very much on the type of player you are. If you're an entirely solo player, I think you may struggle to enjoy the game more once you're through the initial content. Unless you have sort of a really strong love of crafting, then I think the game kind of lacks the immersive story elements of other games. And I think that's going to make it harder for solo players to sort of really get involved in the game. I think also, if you're a very sort of hardcore MMO player, you're going to be getting through the main storyline and sort of a decent amount of the end game content within the first month or two. Although, having said that, the speed at which Amazon have been developing new content, and the fact we've already seen some leaks about new regions, new weapons, etc., suggests more content may be released pretty rapidly after launch, but still, there's quite a lot you could work through fairly quickly. But for me, I think the game excels when you combine everything together. If you're an MMO player who also likes dabbling in a little bit of PvP on the side, maybe attend the occasional territory war, enjoys the gathering and crafting system, that's when the game comes to life. It gives you purpose of what you want to achieve, and honestly, it is super addicting. Finally, with all games, I try and think in a sort of hour to cost comparison. There is easily over 100 hours of content in this game, and probably more, which for $40 or whatever your equivalent local currency is, that doesn't seem bad going. So if you're not sure, then I think it's probably well worth checking out. However, if you did play the beta though, I'd love to know how you found the game. Do you kind of agree with my thoughts on the different aspects? Or do you kind of think I kind of went wrong on a few things and you kind of disagree with me? But do let me know in the comments down below. It's always great to kind of get separate opinions on this stuff. Anyway, that's all I've got time for on this one. Do please give the video a like and share it around. Thank you all for watching, and I shall see you all on the next one.